In a world where the term politician gives an image of cold, ruthless and greed, there arose a man from a small town in Gujarat who went on to become one of the greatest leaders that this world has ever witnessed, the Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi fought for Indian independence in a way which remains unparalleled to this day. He was known as much for his minimalistic attire and gentle behavior as for his revolutionary thoughts and actions. He had a singular belief that all human beings are children of God and nobody is evil. He turned his enemies into friends by means of truth and non-violence and preached righteousness and truth as the only religion. He battled many fierce adversaries and triumphed over them. The weapon in his arsenal was simple yet immensely powerful: truth and non-violence. The Gandhi family dwelled in a small town, Porbandar in Gujarat, which lies in western India. Gandhiji's grandfather, Uttamchand Gandhi, was the Prime Minister or the Diwan of Porbandar. Gandhiji's father, Karamchand Gandhi, was also the Diwan or Chief Minister of Porbandar. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi or Mahatma Gandhi was born on October 2nd, 1869 into a Hindu family in Porbandar, Gujarat, India. His mother, Putali Bai, was the fourth wife of his father. The previous three wives died during childbirth. At the age of 6, Gandhiji started his schooling in Porbandar. Later, at the age of 7, Gandhiji's father became the Diwan of Rajkot and the Gandhi family migrated from Porbandar to Rajkot, where Gandhiji continued his education. Gandhiji, at the age of 13, married with Kastura Bai, who was also the same age. Child marriages were then quite common in India. The young couple was shy and would hesitate to talk to each other. But very soon, the shy introvert child Gandhiji tried becoming bossy and jealous husband who would not let Kasturi Bai play with her friends and would restrict her from going anywhere without his permission, leading to furious arguments between them. The situation would worsen to the extent of not speaking to each other for days. The child groom who was trying to act like a husband was actually a kid at heart. Being frightened of darkness during the night, he would light a lamp when he slept due to his fear of ghosts, but would never disclose this to his wife. At one end, he was striving to be a husband, whereas on the other, he was still in high school, where his scholarship had sharpened, leading towards achieving many small prizes. In high school, Gandhiji always wished to emulate his friend Sikh, not because Sikh possessed some extraordinary talent, but because he was tall and muscular. Sikh once revealed that meat was the only reason behind his strength and told Gandhiji that strength and power were the attributes of only meat eaters. In those days, every Indian envisioned themselves to breathe an air of freedom. Gandhiji, being a patriot, always wished to conquer the British and to make his dream of freedom come true. He thought strength was extremely essential. And immature Gandhi, triggered with the feeling of patriotism, thought that consuming meat was the only way he could build his tower of strength. Gandhiji consumed meat for the first time near a riverside with his friend Sikh. The goat's meat tasted to him like leather. He was also hit by a dreadful nightmare that night in which a goat was bleeding in his stomach. Though petrified and distraught with the nightmare, he still did not give up and continued eating meat, longing to be powerful. Later on, he built a taste for the delicious meat curries that Sikh would bring for him. He kept hiding this truth of eating meat from his mother. He also indulged in smoking in company of Sikh, his brother, and a relative. One day, in order to pay a debt, he stole a piece of gold from his brother's jewelry, and later, when he realized his misstep, he confessed it on a piece of paper and handed it to his father. The ailing father, on hearing on his son's misdeed, simply turned his back and wept copiously. Gandhiji was moved by this incident and decided of never lying to his parents again. This act of his father taught him non-violence, which he then followed throughout his life. In the company of Sikh, Gandhiji also visited a brothel once, but when he sat on the bed next to the woman, his lips were sealed. He left that place in aversion and was abused by that female. He later felt glad that he was safe from committing the sin of being deceitful to his wife. His father stayed ill after this and passed away when Gandhiji was just only 16 years old. After this, Gandhiji graduated from high school and enrolled in a small Indian college which he disliked and returned home in the middle of a term. A family friend then advised Gandhiji to equip himself for eventual succession of his father's post as a Prime Minister of the state after earning a law degree from England. Though Gandhi was interested in studying medicine, the idea of going to England excited him. But in those days, going abroad was unacceptable in their community. Even his mother, Putali Bai, and his wife, Kasturi Bai, were not very pleased with his decision as they feared Gandhiji would take up to alcohol, meat, and women like other Englishmen. But Gandhiji had made up his mind to leave. The community heads considered him outcast after this. For them, he was a sinner. However, his mother blessed him with love and took a vow from him that he would not touch woman, liquor, and meat. Meanwhile, before he left, Gandhiji was blessed with his first son, Hari Lal, whom he had to leave in order to pursue his career at a young age of only 19 years. The moment Gandhiji stepped in England on October 28, 1888, all he could see was men with long black suits wearing hats around, and he was the only one dressed in white. The shame of being the only one in white was already too much for him. He started feeling like an alien in the midst of Englishmen and tried learning the manners of life in London from some elders. He also faced difficulty in forming sentences and would feel shy of conversing with people. He became homesick and would dissolve in tears at night in the memory of his mother. He was also told by his friends that to survive in freezing England, it was compulsory to take up the habits of consuming meat and alcohol. But he did not want to break a vow he had given to his beloved mother before leaving. He preferred eating fruits and would refrain himself from touching meat. He later found a vegetarian hotel which was away from his residence, but he never found any hardship in going there. Later, he started cooking at home for his own self. He also tried to adopt the ways of the Englishmen and took classes for dancing, speaking French, and the art of talking to people. But very soon, he realized that trying to wear someone else's skin will make him lose his own identity. He also felt that he was wasting the hard-earned money that his brother sent him. Soon, he took to a simple lifestyle wherein studying became his only aim in England. Gandhi read Bhagavad Gita, the famous Hindu holy book, for the first time in England, after which he started gaining interest in Hinduism, and later the book Gita became his inspiration throughout his life. Finally, he passed his examination, was called to the bar on 10 June 1891. On 12 June 1891, when he returned back home in Rajkot, his brother welcomed him with a small procession and revealed the truth of his mother not being alive anymore. There was another anxiety which started building within him. He had learned the laws but that of England. He knew nothing about the laws of his own country, India. The frustration within him kept rising even more when he realized he could not earn for his family in spite of being a barrister. Desperate, he tried to become an English teacher in school, but was disqualified and rejected. He was disgusted with his life in India and wanted to escape from India. Finally, destiny knocked his door and he got an opportunity by a large Indian firm in Porbandar to go to South Africa, where he was supposed to assist in a long and complex case in the legal courts. They also promised him a good amount of salary and told him that it would take a year for him to complete the task. He accepted this proposal with delight. A second son named Manilal was born to Kasturabai after his return from England in 1892. He bid his family farewell in April 1893. Not even 24 years now, he set his sail to South Africa to try his luck. The majority in South Africa were blacks and minority were whites, but in spite of this, the minority whites ruled the majority blacks by means of abuse and torture. The condition of Indians in South Africa was piteous and they were considered as low class, referred to as coolies. The Indians could not own a land, were not allowed to do trade, were supposed to live in dirty areas, and were not permitted to be on streets after 9 in the night. In short, an Indian was not a human being for the Europeans. Gandhiji sensed this in the atmosphere and very soon experienced it firsthand while he was trying to Pretoria. In the middle of his journey to Pretoria, when the train reached the capital of Natal at about 9 p.m., a white passenger who boarded the train objected to the presence of colored man in the compartment. Gandhiji was ordered by a railway officer to shift to a third class, but he refused to do so, pointing towards his ticket, which was of first class. The constable threw Gandhiji and his luggage off the train. It was bitterly cold, but Gandhiji's overcoat was in his luggage and his luggage was in the hands of the railway authorities. Gandhiji did not dare to ask them for the luggage for the fear of being insulted again. He kept shivering throughout that endless night and thought to himself whether he should fight for his rights or just go back home. By the end of the night, he made up his mind to fight not only for his own rights, but also for the rights of his people. The ordinary Mohandas set in motion towards becoming a Mahatma, which turned his life altogether. Gandhiji never forgot the disgrace and humiliation he had to bear during his journey. In a week's time, he called a meeting of the locals Indians to discuss their dreadful condition. In the discussion, the Indians made him aware of the grievous situation and told him how they were mistreated. Every Indian was addressed as a coolie. Listening to their plight, Gandhiji's tongue that always hesitated to speak had reformed together and he made his first public speech in that meeting. Gandhiji told themselves to change in the first place and be tolerant of their religious practice, be sanitary of their personal habits, and be honest in their work. He promised to help them in the best way possible. Later, Gandhiji sorted the case that he had came for and united both the parties outside the court by mutual settlement. He resolved a few more cases in the similar manner and finally headed to Durban for his return. In his honor, a party was organized in which few people threw a light on a bill in a newspaper. This bill, if passed, would deprive the Natal Indians to vote for the members of the Legislative Assembly. All present in the party requested Gandhiji to await for the month and help them fight against this bill. Gandhiji drove a campaign to work against the bill immediately, but in spite of opposition, the bill was passed. Gandhiji then formed an organization called Natal Indian Congress to give a direction to achieve the desired Indian rights. All members paid the respective fees and some wealthier ones also made huge contributions. After loads of attempts and failures in 1896, Gandhiji returned back to Rajkot to bring his wife and children for staying along with him in Natal. Meanwhile, he gave lots of interviews, traveled extensively spreading his word, appealing sympathy for the South African Indians. The shy, mediocre Gandhiji, who hesitated to converse, once was now the speaker of thousands of mouths of suffering Indians in South Africa. In December, Gandhiji sailed back to South Africa with his wife, 2 sons, and an orphan nephew. As soon as Gandhiji stepped ashore, there was a huge outburst of rotten eggs, stones, and bricks on him, and the mob started screaming, "Hang old Gandhi." They tore off his turban and clothes, and he was beaten up brutally. Such merciless protests against him continued outside his house several times following this incident. After these protests came to rest, Gandhiji was asked to identify the people by whom he was assaulted. But the non-violent Mahatma refused completely, saying, "I'm sure that when the truth becomes known, they will be sorry for their conduct." His refusal to prosecute the victims dropped the heads of the whites in shame, and many of them turned to be his friends. He kept experimenting with his diet and started eating food without any condiments, without any taste. He believed that the taste of the tongue is a mere thought of the mind and a human body should not be restricted onto it. In 1904, he founded a weekly newspaper called Indian Opinion, which was comprised of his views and ideas and was published in Durban and Natal. 37 years old Gandhiji took a vow of brahmacharya or celibacy and did not break it throughout his life. He started teaching his wife Kasturibai about the ideas he believed in, and she also began following the path of Mahatma. According to the Asian Population Registration Act, the Asians, including Indians, had to register their name, age, address, job, and other personal information and carry an identity card with their fingerprints at all times. If they failed to do so, they were punishable and would be put in prison and charged heavy fines or deportation. The main agenda was to restrict more Indians from entering South Africa. The act was passed in July 1907 and was called the Black Act by Indians. Gandhiji, along with his followers, decided that they would die but will not submit. This movement against the Black Act was given the name of Satyagraha or Truth Force by him. He went to jail for 2 months for this protest. When he was released, General Christian Smuts, a Boer leader, offered Gandhiji a settlement, stating that if the Indians stopped flooding South Africa, they would repeal the offensive Black Act. Trusting his words, Gandhiji became the first one to register. Unfortunately, General Smuts went back on his words. The Indian felt betrayed by Gandhi and he was beaten up by them for his action. Gandhiji was jailed for the second time. He spent most of his time in jail reading books. The jails were flooded with satyagrahis, and finally Gandhiji was freed. During the next 6 years, Gandhiji and his followers were arrested ample of times due to their non-violent rallies. To support his cause, he often used Indian Opinion newspaper, which became one of his major means of communication. In 1912, the Satyagraha campaign revived again. Women participated for the first time, including his wife Kasturibai. Many women were imprisoned and Indian men were fumed at the sight of women being tossed into jails. Gandhiji incited the Indian miners to strike against the annual tax on free laborers. On 6 November 1913, Gandhiji again set out with 2,037 men, 127 women, and 57 children and crossed the border of Transvaal, continued his protest. He was arrested the same night but asked the miners to continue their protest until he returned, and they did so. He was bailed out, but on 8 November, he was arrested once more while he was distributing bread to the marchers. He was again bailed and started marching. On 9 November, he was arrested for the third time in 4 days. Gandhiji was sentenced to 12 months of hard labor with his chief aides imprisoned with him. Though Gandhiji was in jail, the miners wouldn't move as they had decided they would not listen to any orders or threats. The government of Transvaal desperately wanted the miners and Gandhiji to get violent so that they too could get violent with them in return. But the non-violent Gandhi had left them paralyzed. After trying every possible weapon, the government of Transvaal was in vain. They sent soldiers to force the miners to get back to work, which killed and injured a vast number of them. The whole world was watching the injustice taking place with Gandhiji and his followers. The Indians demanded the Satyagrahi prisoners be released, after which Gandhiji and some others were freed. The tax was abolished and non-Christian marriages were recognized. Finally, Satyagraha led him towards his first victory. After 20 years of prolonged struggle in South Africa, Gandhiji has finished his fight. He not only gained freedom, but he also learned the power of truth and non-violence. The Mahatma started off with his journey to India, where he had a lot more to do for his people. He made up his mind to break the British rule and start the independence movement once again with the most powerful, priceless and matchless weapon, Satyagraha. India, the sparrow of gold, was ruled by many oppressors in the past, British being the last ones. The tiny Britain ruled a vast country India and oppressed them with inequality and injustice. The greed for freedom lied in the heart of every Indian. Few Indian rulers of certain provinces would also wag their tails in front of the British. The nation was in distress and had the only one and only political party, Indian National Congress. They demanded self-government in 1906, but their voice never reached Britain. The Indians were aware of their destination, but unaware of the path to reach there. Then stepped Gandhiji on 5th January 1915 in Bombay. He was already well known in the India as Mahatma, as his crusade of South Africa was not hidden from anybody. But he disliked it as he considered himself a very ordinary man and felt that Mahatma was too extravagant for him. He began staying with his follower in Sabarmati Ashram, also called Satyagraha Ashram in Ahmedabad, which he himself had founded. He taught his followers the meaning and power of Satyagraha. Religious and political teachings would go hand in hand in the ashram. Around 80% population of India were peasants, and without their support, the dream of independence could never become a reality. To win their support, Gandhiji started wearing simple loincloth like them. For him, freedom did not just mean freedom from the British, but also freedom from poverty and inequality. He wanted to transform his motherland into a land of his dreams, which was free from all strains. He admitted a family of untouchables in his ashram to save them from the upper caste. He started working for the upliftment of various peasants in Champaran, Kheda and Ahmedabad for their respective rights. He began to use fasting as his weapon at various times to eradicate the injustice with peasants. Their plea would be heard and agreed only because the Mahatma Gandhi was fasting, because nobody wanted him to die as he had become the most important person for Indians. Thus, Mahatma Gandhi had found another powerful non-violent weapon, that is fasting. Gandhiji never took advantage of his enemy's weakness, and proved it by helping the British with Indian soldiers during World War I. During the war, freedom of speech and civil rights of Indians were suppressed, and the Indians expected some freedom after the end of the war. A British commission headed by Sir Rowlatt was sent to India for an inquiry, and the Rowlatt Act was passed on 18 March 1919, according to which the government now could arrest and imprison people without any trial in a court of law, and could impose restriction on civil rights of any person at any place who was suspected of terrorism. Gandhiji announced a hartal or strike in protest to Rowlatt Act on April 6, 1919. The whole nation was at a standstill, and later Gandhiji was arrested for his action. Not everyone was a Mahatma like Gandhi, which was soon proved as people started looting, killing and rioting during the protests in Punjab. Gandhiji headed to Punjab to stop the nonsense, but was arrested midway and sent back to Bombay. Upset, he called off the campaign and thought that his people still needed to understand the meaning of non-violence and the values of Satyagraha. On 13th April 1919, in JALLIANWALA Bagh, Amritsar, a meeting was held consisting of 15 to 20,000 people, entirely enclosed by square buildings. While the meeting was going on, a British officer, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, entered with 50 armed soldiers and stationed them on either side of the main entrance. Without warning, he ordered them to open fire on the mob. Almost 400 people died on the spot, and more than 1,000 were severely injured during the incident. This event was called Amritsar Massacre or Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. Gandhiji was shocked when he became aware of the massacre. He visited Punjab and conducted an inquiry for it. The people had now started to worship him and gave him another name, Bapu, which meant father. Gandhiji's next plan was the non-cooperation movement. He condemned the laws of untouchability and supported the use of khadi, while he boycotted foreign clothes. As a part of the movement, he started spinning the wheel to make their own clothes out of khadi. He believed it would help India eradicate poverty and Indians would no longer be dependent on British clothing. He pressed the Indians to boycott British services and products and thought it was the best way to bring down the British government. Meanwhile, the Khilafat movement started in 1919, an attempt by the Indian Muslim community to support the Khalifa of Turkey, who was of great religious importance to them. The aim of the movement was to protest against England as they had attacked the Khalifa. Gandhiji related this movement with non-cooperation with the objective of gaining support of Muslims in Swaraj independence. Fortunately, he succeeded, and it led to an entire non-violent unarmed army of Hindus and Muslims against the British. Gandhiji was rebellious but in a peaceful manner. He had declared a war against the British, but a non-violent unarmed war. Suddenly, the demoralized Indians were charged up and ready to follow the Mahatma blindly. For them, his words were precious and nothing could stop them from obeying him. All his followers traveled across the states to preach non-cooperation protest. By September 1921, he adopted his permanent costumes, the simple lion cloth worn by most of the Indian peasants. The non-cooperation movement shocked the British authorities. On 4th February 1922, in Chauri Chaura, a violent clash broke up between local police and protesters. Gandhiji went on a 3-day fast to appeal to the Indians to stop all resistance. The outraged British started bulking the jails with Indians, and by December, 20,000 Indians were jailed, and the following months, another 10,000 were sent to prison. Meanwhile, the Congress held its annual meeting in which Gandhiji was elected as the sole executive authority. People lost their patience and were disappointed with the outcome. They expected people's rule, which was nowhere in the picture, and instead there were riots and people were getting arrested in bulks. Since Gandhiji never believed in violence, he decided to set off his campaign in a small area, Bardoli, near Bombay. However, before he could start up with his campaign, an Indian mob attacked a group of British policemen. Gandhiji then realized that his men still did not know the meaning of Satyagraha, and he called off for all campaign of civil disobedience. He wished for a free India, but not on the cost of men put to death. The British concluded that this as his end, and at 53 years of age, he was imprisoned for the next 6 years, leaving the whole nation weeping and crying for him. Gandhiji carried his will along with him in the jail and would spin cloths and read books. He also wrote his autobiography during those times. Unfortunately, he was attacked by appendicitis and fell sick in the jail. The British government did not want him to die in their hands, as they knew the consequences they would face after his death, so they called the Indian doctors. Gandhiji took time to recover and was released from jail after 2 years of imprisonment. But when he returned, he found the feeling of Satyagraha, the struggle for freedom, and all that he had envisioned lost somewhere, leading into a new horrific scenario of India. To his surprise, there were riots between the Hindus and the Muslims, and they were no longer working together. In vain, he decided to purify India. For him, India could achieve freedom only if India was pure and never before that. He announced that he would fast for 21 days if the Hindus and the Muslims in the name of caste would not stop fighting. To dramatize the situation even more, he fasted in a Muslim's house. While the fast lasted, millions of Hindus and Muslims took an oath to unite. He traveled throughout the country to collect funds for a movement. People would not only give him funds but also take his blessing. There were people who believed he was God and actually worshipped his photograph. But he never appreciated it as he considered himself as an ordinary man. Tired of all the traveling and speeches, Gandhiji spent a year in isolation in his ashram in the year 1926. This was called the Silent Year, which had 52 silent Mondays, which he did not speak at all. In 1927, he again started with his tour to India and now also worked for the advancement and equality of women and abstinence from drugs and alcohol. In November, he was informed about the British Commission that was coming to India. The agenda was to investigate and reform the condition of the country. A commission to reform India without a single Indian was not digestible for the people of the country. They revolted strongly against it by hanging flags and screaming, "Go back." They could not afford their fate to be written once again by the British. Gandhiji realized that this was the right time to resume Satyagraha, and it started from the place where it had ended, Bardoli. The taxes were increased by 22% for the peasants of Bardoli, and Gandhiji told them not to pay the taxes. All the things which were bread and butter for peasants, their farms, animals and equipments were all confiscated, but they all remained strong. In protest, they observed a strike on June 12 throughout India. After a lot of struggle, in August, the tax increase was cancelled and Satyagraha led to faith once again. Everybody was waiting Gandhiji's next move. Gandhiji has announced in the annual Congress meeting that henceforth the fight would be for complete independence. Everyone thought Gandhi would declare a war now. But the great Mahatma maintained non-violence. For him, it was better to be ruled by the British than to attain freedom by means of violence. The British had monopoly on salt. No one could make, sell or purchase it from any other source except British. In February 1930, Gandhiji attacked the salt law, which was supported by every individual in the country India. The British salt was expensive for the peasants. Gandhi decided to start with the Dandi March. On March 12, Gandhiji and 78 disciples headed towards south on foot. Each day, more volunteers joined them and they reached seashore Dandi on 5th April, trekking 200 miles. Thousands of people had accompanied Gandhi on the way and his presence made people feel blessed. They kissed his footprints as he walked. Everyone was curious of what Gandhiji was up to. Next day at dawn, he went to the seashores and picked up a pinch of salt and defied the salt laws. This was a sign for the Indians that they should choose civil disobedience along with him and break the monopoly of British on salt. All over India, there was an outbreak of a new revolution. People sold salt illegally and the British filled the jails with Indians. But the Indians became iron-jawed. They decided not to stop until they had fulfilled their mission. Once again, non-cooperation had revived. People boycotted British goods and refused to pay taxes. They quit their government jobs and became fearless like never before. Attaining freedom was the only agenda for the rich and the poor both. On May 4th, police arrested Gandhiji. Though Gandhiji was imprisoned, his patrons continued with the protest. Unfortunately, in an incident, the marchers led to the salt works where they were beaten up brutally by the British policemen, but it turned into a matter of shock when not a single martyr raised even a hand in defense. The bleeding bodies kept lying on the ground. The world witnessed the injustice, and the British themselves felt ashamed for their uncivilized actions. The British neither had enough jail nor enough functionaries to keep the country operating. They were left with no volition but to free Gandhiji and other Congress leaders. Gandhiji was almost God for the country, and nobody would dare to cross him. After many discussions, Gandhiji cancelled the civil disobedience movement. British agreed on giving freedom on salt and freed the prisoners. Gandhiji tried to negotiate with the King of London, but the cabinet had become harsher than even before, leading to his arrest on 14 January 1932. 20,000 people were again behind bars by February. Meanwhile, the British started constructing a new constitution which stated that the Muslims would only vote for the Muslims, the Hindus would only vote for Hindus, and the untouchables would only vote for the untouchable. Gandhiji knew that this was going to create a rift between untouchables and the Hindus, while he was striving hard to unite them. On September 13th, Gandhiji announced that he would fast up to death if this rule was not abandoned. As always, the British feared his death, as nobody wanted to take the blame of his death on their shoulders, as he was no less than God for the Indian masses. He started his fast on 20th September and within 4 days became extremely weak. The doctors feared the fast, if continued, would lead to his death. Many Indians who followed him fasted along with him. At last, a compromise was reached and Gandhiji broke his fast. There was no separation of voting between the Hindus and the untouchables, and along with that, the untouchables were given a particular number of reserved seats as well, which would guarantee them representation. To Gandhi's delight, it was no less than a miracle. For the first time in 3,000 years, the temples were opened for the untouchables, and it was all due to this great man's suffering and influence. In May 1933, Gandhiji fasted for 21 days for his personal reasons, but the British government, petrified of him dying in their hands, released him from jail. After 3 days, he was re-arrested for a civil disobedience act and again freed. He was arrested once again for disobeying the court and was later released after he began fasting. Bapu, or Mahatma Gandhi, used the non-violent weapons of fasting several times in his life for various reasons. Although he was habituated to fast since childhood because of his mother, still fasting for such long periods was indeed a great deal, which was not possible for an ordinary human being. For the next 6 years, Gandhiji stayed out of jail and also out of politics, but everything in the Congress party worked with his consent. The peasants would come and take his blessings and advice, while he would preach them the way of life. In 1939, the Second World War breaks out. Japan had joined the Germans against the British, and England, without India's help, was in great trouble. Keeping this in mind, the British freed many Indian leaders. America and China pressed British government to agree to the demands of Indian independence. Gandhiji, along with his leaders, renewed civil disobedience and were arrested once again. The Indians, filled with agitation, attacked the British with violence in response to the arrest. Gandhiji, who always preached non-violence, was disheartened with the outcome. The British accused him of being the sole reason for the violent scenario. Though he always fought for non-violence, he was the one who was blamed for it. Pained by such accusation, he decided to fast once again for 21 days. Old Gandhiji was now 72 years old and everyone expected him to die. Even the British government freed him due to the fear of his death, but he refused and fasted in jail. Unfortunately, not him, but his wife, Kasturi Bai, who accompanied him in his jail, died on his lap on 22nd February 1944. The 60-year-old marriage had come to an end. Filled with grief, Gandhiji said, "I feel the loss more than I thought I should." Later, he was struck down by malaria and was freed from prison on 6 May 1944. After being released from the jail, the trauma for Gandhiji raised even more when Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, demanded for the separate state cut out of India for Muslims. Gandhiji always wanted his countrymen to unite and stay under the same roof. For him, caste and creed was never a matter of consideration, and he believed all human beings were equal. Second World War ended in summer 1945, and Churchill's government of England was replaced by a new government. The new government made it clear they wanted an early realization of self-government in India. A British commission was sent to India to work out the issue of independence, and finally, Nehru was told to form his government in August 1946. Due to Hindu-Muslim conflict, a ruthless riot broke out and 5,000 people were slaughtered in Calcutta. 77 years old Gandhi walked 49 villages barefoot over roads filled with felt or glass by his enemies and made each remote area calm during his pilgrimage in Bengal in the midst of riots. On February 1947, it was announced that British would leave India and Gandhiji's dreams of Swaraj was on its way. But Jinnah was still annoyed as the demand for a separate state was still not approved. Jinnah threatened Gandhiji of a civil war if his demands were not met. Hungry for independence and to get rid of violence, the other Congress leaders agreed for a separate state, Pakistan, but Gandhiji was adamant and did not want independence so much the way he wanted unity. In spite of Gandhiji's opposition, Jinnah's demands were met. Jinnah died the following year, dividing India. The partition plan was announced on 3rd June and India attained freedom on 15th August 1947. But Gandhiji, disheartened with the division of his motherland, refused to participate in the celebration of freedom. Instead, he prayed in a Muslim household in Calcutta where the slaughtering of humans was still taking place. While Gandhiji was trying to retain peace, Gandhiji was attacked by a mob in his bedroom. Saddened with the incident, he decided to fast until sanitary returned to Calcutta. Within 3 days, everything fell in place and the leaders plead it would never happen again. Peace and harmony returned in Calcutta, though the entire nation was burning with terror. 7 to 8 million people were butchered in the riots during partition. The majority in both the states, India and Pakistan, kept slaughtering the minority. Around 15 million people were displaced and the nation became crazy and rebellious. Disheartened, Gandhi moved on to Delhi, where the Hindus kept slaughtering the Muslims. Helpless and filled with sorrow, he used his weapon again and started to fast in Delhi on January 13, 1948 for peace. Old Bapu, who was now 78 years old, did not worry about himself but his heart pain for his countrymen. With the fear of losing the Mahatma, the Hindus stopped slaughtering the Muslims and finally Gandhiji broke his fast. Gandhiji, who was still striving with his health, trying to recover from the fast, held a prayer meeting one evening. The holy prayer turned into an atrocious incident when an explosion took place. To everyone's surprise, the people behind the explosion were the demonic fanatic Hindus who wanted to eradicate Gandhiji's existence forever. They accused Gandhi of opposing them and supporting the Muslims and found him an obstacle in their way. Gandhiji was shielded in this incident. On 30th January 1948, Gandhiji held a prayer meeting outdoors according to his custom. A 35-year-old newspaper editor, Nathuram Godse, who was a member of the fanatic group, sat in the front row. As Gandhiji walked through the crowd to sit on the platform, Godse removed his small pistol and shot him twice at around 5:10 p.m. The magnificent Mahatma crumbled and fell on the ground, taking his last breath, uttering the words, "Hey Ram" or "Oh God," at the age of 78 years. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was assassinated in the garden of the former Birla House. His photograph was made a part of the Indian currency and also printed on the Indian postal stamps. Mahatma Gandhi's funeral processions was of 8 kilometers long. Gandhi fought for much more than independence. His causes included civil rights for women, the abolition of the caste system, and the fair treatment of all people, regardless of religion. Thank you.